Recently, I took a look at a 1080p gaming monitor that actually impressed me, and it made me think real hard about the choices I've been making as a YouTuber when it comes to displays and resolutions. Because I've been switching to 1440p for the longest time. I've been pushing high refresh rate gaming for a shorter period of time, but I have been pushing it. And when it comes down to it, not everybody has the budget to get high refresh rate and high resolution. So, which is better? High refresh rate or high resolution? And today's video is all about that. So, let's get right into it. Hello and welcome. My name is Wolfie. You're watching GreaterThanPie, and I appreciate you for being here today. So, resolution or refresh rate? Which is more important? Well, it's a complicated question, just like anything that involves tech on this channel. You see, when it comes to resolution, there is an inherent benefit the larger the display gets. As you go up in size, the distance between the pixels increases. So 1080p on something that is 60 inches will look absolutely appalling as opposed to something that is 4K and 60 inches. But if you're on a screen as small as the Steam Deck right over here, this will look great at 1080p. Unfortunately, this is 720p, or well, 800p to be specific. Point is, as the screen size gets larger, so too should the resolution. The problem is, the difference between perceived resolution and real resolution is very difficult to find. That is because it's not easy to prove one or the other. Let me explain. Everybody sees differently. Everybody sees at different clarity at different points in their life. They may see sharper than they do in later points in their life. Therefore, somebody who has a 27-inch monitor at 1080p might be completely happy, as opposed to somebody who's got sharper vision who might not be as satisfied. But it gets even deeper than that. There's actually a formula that some TV manufacturers use to determine what resolution a TV should be at what size. Everything from the distance you sit from the screen, the size of the screen, and the resolution of the screen will contribute to perceived resolution. The further you are away to the size of the screen will actually increase the likelihood that a lower resolution image will look sharp as opposed to a high resolution one. This is why TVs are capping out around 4K, and 8K is starting to look ridiculously beyond what we actually need. And it's entirely because the perceived resolution of 8K versus 4K is almost non-existent. But this poses a specific problem for computer monitors because we sit really close to them. And before we actually hit the 1080p generation, things were, well, complicated. We had CRT screens for the longest time, and then we eventually moved to LCD screens, which were worse in many ways than the CRT ones for displaying images. At that point, we then hit a race that eventually ended up at 1080p. Monitors around this time were anywhere between 14 to around 23 inches. But then we wanted to push further. We wanted bigger and bigger displays because bigger and bigger displays can increase productivity just by being able to see more of it without having to squint as hard. 27 and even 32-inch monitors are now fairly common. And if you look behind me, I've got a very interesting combination here, which includes a 21:9 wide display, which is another unusual grain on top of all of this. But we'll have to talk more about ultrawides a little bit later because it's a different topic for a different time. We're gonna be sticking to 16:9 for now. So because monitors are generally anywhere between 14 to 32 inches, there's a wide gambit in which 1080p, 1440p, and 4K can all live. And it makes sense to some degree to have these multiple resolutions. 1080p is best on monitors that are around 14 to 23 inches. 27 inches is a bleed over point in which that and 1440p share. 1440p is generally good within 27 to 32 inches, and 4K is pretty much going to be needed for everything above that. But these are just general rules of thumb. They're not actually 100% true all the time. And more importantly, as the resolution of a display goes up, so too does the power needed to drive it. Which brings me to the next point, high refresh rate gaming. Gaming seems to be the main area in which high refresh rate benefits. Resolution is actually very, very powerful for productivity. 1440p and editing videos has been my go-to for a long time, and having to downsize to 1080p was actually a hindrance when I was working on the video about the monitor that was at 1080p, as opposed to the next video, which I edited on this setup, which absolutely blew it away. The amount of pixels you have determines how much space can be actually used when doing productivity-based tasks. And ask anybody who actually does a lot in Excel, Premiere Pro, just on the internet in general, they will tell you that extra screen real estate is important. It's actually one of the reasons why having a monitor in profile is actually super useful for those who have to look at large strings of text, like coders. But for gaming, high refresh rate is infinitely better. Unlike the CRT of old, the refresh rate on an LCD panel is more important. Because of the way that the pixels are actually drawn on the screen, a lower refresh rate will be perceived as a smeary image. There is also an issue that you can run into where the frames per second and the refresh rate are so off that it results in tearing on your display. Now, you can always cap your frames per second, but if you ask anybody who's actually used a high refresh rate display, they will always tell you it's worth it. This, though, leads to a very unusual dilemma. If you want absolutely the best resolution you can get and the highest frame rate you can get, it's going to cost a lot. And even worse, the hardware to run it like that is going to cost even more. Now, as opposed to 1080p, which you can get a high refresh rate display for under $200, and you can get a GPU that runs that for around $300, you could easily see that as a setup that is preferable, at least cost-wise, as opposed to a 4K gaming system. Additionally, there is another grain in this that's actually really complicated. Now, when it comes to resolution in gaming, things are weird. Most games can run at higher resolutions than they were designed to. For example, using a game like Half-Life 2, which can run at 1440p, which is great, but those assets weren't designed for it. And because they weren't designed for it, it's not gonna look its absolute best. Skyrim's another game that was not designed to run above 1080p. In fact, actually, even on Anniversary Edition, it is locked to 1080p on most displays. Because of that, Skyrim just refuses to go to a higher resolution. And the engine struggles at 1440p and does all sorts of weird things, especially in Fallout, which allows you to go that high. Because the assets were not designed for above 1080p, because everything wasn't made to go that high, you will literally see diminishing returns the second you go above 1080p. But we are in the next generation of consoles, which were designed to run at 4K and 2K. But more importantly, they were designed to look their best on 4K displays. And because of that, we're in a situation where games are starting to come out that look bad at 1080p. Very few of them, though. The newest game we tested was Forspoken. It only really had some issues on some trailing edges, and more specifically in Flora. The game is perfectly playable at 1080p. In fact, it looks great. But Halo Infinite, a game that is infinitely perplexing, that game had some problems. It actually looked really bad at 1080p. And it might have been because my foliage quality was set too high, because the graphics preset I typically use is the absolute highest one. It might be that 343 made it so that they knew that if your GPU was like this, then you'd be running at a higher resolution. Consistently, foliage seems to be the one area that modern games take advantage of that 1080p cannot display properly. Cyberpunk 2077 was another game where really the only issues were on some of the really far distant objects that would be 1 pixel long. And of course, that makes sense. There's not enough pixel data on the screen to make that look great. But in the foreground, everything looked perfectly fine. This then brings us to what I consider the PC gamer compromise between 4K, 1080p, high refresh rate, and low refresh rate. And that is the 1440p 144Hz monitors. This has been the compromise for a while now, and there's a good reason for it. Cost-wise, these monitors are generally anywhere between $200 and $250. Size-wise, they're great at 27 inches. which is generally where a lot of people sit on the monitor size. And you get sort of the best of both worlds. It's higher than 1080p and higher than 60 Hz. It's a win-win, right? And while 1440p 144 Hz is a great resolution, there are other issues that can contribute to a worse display experience on these monitors. For example, VA versus IPS. I've had both of them. I've had both of them at the same resolution. I'll tell you, I will prefer IPS every single day of the week. Another thing that can actually help you along with high refresh rate gaming is having adaptive sync. And almost every single monitor now has that, and thanks to AMD, just about every GPU can use FreeSync, which means all of us benefit when it comes to picking a new monitor these days. So where does that leave us in this debate of 1080p, 4K, 1440p, high refresh rate versus low refresh rate? In truth, the best option is probably to compromise. But when it comes down to it, you should pick what actually works best for you. If you are in a budget of just $200 for your gaming monitor, get the 1080p monitor with a high refresh rate. It will be an infinitely better gaming experience for you than buying a 1440p 60 Hz panel. But if you are focusing primarily only on office work, only on things that don't require that extra frames per second, things like video editing or photo editing, then get the higher resolution. The higher resolution is better for productivity in general, which is why the 1440p compromise is probably the go-to for most people. But those were just my thoughts on this. Let me know yours down below in the comments. And while you're down there, you can take a look at our merch store, maybe give us a super thanks, or click any of our other videos to help support our channel. I will see you in the next video. Wolfie, out.